The heat inside the structure was not merely a temperature, it was a physical weight, pressing down with the suffocating heaviness of a wet wool blanket. It smelled of things that had been left to rot: damp straw, unwashed bodies, ancient timber, and the metallic tang of terror that seems to seep into the grain of wood and remain there long after the screaming stops. Flies navigated the stagnant air in lazy, hypnotic spirals, landing on sweat-slicked skin with an arrogance that suggested they knew no one had the energy to swat them away. In this corner of the territory, pain was not an event to be reacted to. It was simply the baseline of existence, as constant and unremarkable as the horizon itself. Then came the sound, distinct and chilling in its familiarity. The slow, rhythmic drag of iron links sliding over rough planks. It wasn't the accidental clatter of a tool dropped in haste, but the deliberate, heavy pull of containment. A whip cracked, snapping against the empty air, not to draw blood, but to carve out silence. It was a noise meant to assert dominance, a reminder that in this suffocating room, freedom was a concept that had been left at the door. She stood on the raised platform, her bare feet gripping the warped, splinter-filled boards as if the wood itself might swallow her. Iron cuffs, pitted with rust and likely forged for livestock, bit into her wrists. The metal had chafed the skin raw, leaving dark, angry rings that looked less like wounds and more like permanent brands. The Great War had officially ended 4 years prior. The cannons had cooled, the treaties were signed, and politicians in distant cities had patted themselves on the back for stitching a broken nation back together. But out here, where the law was thin and the shadows were long, the war had simply changed shape. It was no longer fought with armies, but with silence and indifference. The small crowd of men gathered below did not jeer or shout. They calculated. They were farmers with drought-hardened eyes, and ranchers whose souls had been eroded by years of bad yields. They looked at the girl not as a human being with a name and a history, but as a potential asset to be weighed against the cost of feed. The auctioneer, sweating through a collar that was grey with grime, forced a smile that didn't reach his dead eyes. "Number 42, the auctioneer bellowed, his voice practiced and devoid of empathy. 18 years of age, no kin to speak of, no papers, strong enough for fieldwork, quiet enough for the house." He consulted a ragged ledger, flipping a page with a licked thumb. "Sold twice before, returned twice. They say she's broken, but I say she's just tame." He looked up, scanning the faces of the men who smelled of tobacco and apathy. "We start the bidding at $5. Silence stretched out, thick and uncomfortable. A man in the front row spat a stream of brown juice into the dust, shaking his head. The girl, Eliza Moore, didn't flinch. She stared at a knot in the floorboards, retreating into the fortress of her own mind. She had learned long ago that reacting only invited more pain. Tears were a luxury she could no longer afford. Her reserves had run dry somewhere between the first sale and the second. Her dress, a tattered rag that might have once been blue, hung loosely on a frame that was dangerously thin. A bruise bloomed across her cheekbone, a purple testament to the rough handling of the morning. $4! The auctioneer tried again, desperation creeping into his tone. The silence remained absolute. $3! The men shifted their weight, boots scraping against the dirt. It wasn't cruelty that held their tongues, but a cold economic reality. A broken mule wasn't worth the hay, and a broken girl wasn't worth the trouble. Eliza's shoulders slumped, not with relief, but with the crushing exhaustion of being unwanted even as a commodity. Just as the auctioneer prepared to dismiss her, a voice cut through the stagnant air from the back of the barn. 20. It was spoken softly, yet it carried the weight of a gavel. The crowd parted, turning to see a man standing in the doorway, framed by the blinding white light of the afternoon sun. He was older, perhaps nearly 60, with a coat the color of dried tobacco leaf and shoulders that curved inward as if protecting a hollow chest. He held his hat in his hands, fingers nervously tracing the brim. His name was Silas Reed, and he looked like a man who had survived a tragedy only to realize that survival was the punishment. The auctioneer blinked, stunned by the sum. 20? You sure, mister? Silas didn't speak. He simply nodded, his eyes fixed on the girl with an intensity that was hard to read. Sold. The word rang out, hasty and final. The tension in the room broke. dissolving into murmurs. And here, as the dust motes dance in the shaft of light and the transaction settles, I have a request. If you find value in stories that don't shy away from the grit, stories that explore the dark corners of history and the resilience of the human spirit, please take a moment to engage with this content. It isn't just about metrics, it's about signaling that you want to return to this kind of slow-burning, immersive storytelling. Eliza didn't look up until the auctioneer shoved her toward the stairs. She stumbled, her legs betraying her, but Silas was there before she hit the ground. His hands were calloused, but surprisingly gentle as he steadied her. When his gaze fell upon the crescent-shaped scar on her wrist, his breath hitched, a microscopic crack in his stoic facade. Silas led her out into the blinding afternoon, the sudden brightness stinging eyes accustomed to the gloom. She walked several paces behind him, the chains clinking with a sound that seemed to physically pain him. They walked until the town was a smudge of grey against the horizon. Silas stopped near a twisted oak tree, the only shade for miles. He reached into his pocket and produced a key, small and dark. "No one should have to wear these," he muttered, kneeling to unlock the cuffs. The mechanism clicked, and the iron fell away, hitting the dirt with a heavy thud. Eliza rubbed her wrists, her eyes darting to his face, scanning for the catch. Kindness, in her experience, was always the prelude to a different kind of cruelty. "Why?" she asked, her voice rasping from disuse. "Why pay that much for something broken?" Silas didn't look at her. He looked at the horizon where the heat shimmered like water. "I didn't buy you to own you, Eliza. I bought you so they wouldn't sell you again." The ride to his ranch was a silent endurance test. The landscape was brutal and unforgiving, a vast expanse of scrub brush and red dirt that seemed determined to starve anything that tried to live on it. When they finally arrived, dusk was bleeding purple across the sky. The ranch was a testament to decline. The fence posts leaned like drunkards, the barn roof sagged, and the main cabin looked as though it was slowly sinking into the earth. It was a place where hope had packed its bags and left years ago. Inside, the cabin was sparse, populated by shadows and the ghosts of a life Silas tried hard not to remember. For the first few days, they existed in separate orbits. Eliza worked with a fierce, terrified energy, hauling water, scrubbing floors, mending clothes, driven by the instinct that usefulness was the only defense against abandonment. Silas repaired the perimeter, his hammer strikes echoing like a clock counting down to something inevitable. On the fourth day, the fragile peace was shattered. A cloud of dust appeared on the road, announcing visitors long before they arrived. 3 riders materialized from the heat haze. Leading them was Sheriff Caleb Horn, a man who wore his badge not as a symbol of service, but as a license to do as he pleased. He rode with a languid, predatory grace, smiling as he brought his horse to a halt at the fence line. "Silas Reed," Horn drawled, his voice like oil sliding over gravel. "Heard you made a purchase." His eyes slid past Silas and locked onto Eliza, who stood frozen on the porch. Recognition flickered in the sheriff's eyes, cold, sharp, and dangerous. "Didn't think I'd see that face again." Silas stepped between them, his hand hovering near his hip. "She's under my protection, Horn." The sheriff chuckled, a dry sound that had no humor in it. He pulled a single bullet from his belt and set it carefully on the fence post. "Just a reminder, Silas. Some debts don't die, and some secrets don't stay buried." As the riders turned and galloped away, leaving a choking cloud of dust in their wake, the silence that descended was heavier than before. Eliza walked to the fence and picked up the bullet, rolling the cold metal between her fingers. "Who was that?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Silas stared at the retreating figures, his face a mask of old sorrow. "A man who thinks he owns the past," he replied quietly. That night, a storm rolled in, thunder shaking the cabin walls. By the light of the dying fire, Eliza placed a silver pocket watch on the table, the only thing she had managed to keep hidden through the years. "You knew my father," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "Don't lie to me. Tell me what happened." Silas looked at the watch, then at her, and the weight of 8 years of silence finally crushed him. "My father sold them out," he whispered. He traded your family's location for this land. I heard him planning it. I rode to warn them, but I was too late. The fire had already started. The confession hung in the air, toxic and suffocating. Eliza stared at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and betrayal. "And you?" she accused, her voice rising. "What did you do?" Silas looked into the fire, seeing the flames of that night reflected in the embers. "I froze," he admitted, the shame fresh in his voice. "I saw the smoke, and I turned around. I told myself I'd fix it later, but there is no later when everything is burning." Eliza turned away, disgust radiating from her posture. "Why now?" she asked, her back to him. "Why come for me after all this time?" Silas's answer was barely audible over the rain hammering the roof. "Because I can't sleep, Eliza. Because I'm tired of living as the man who walked away." Outside, the wind howled, sounding like the screams of the past trying to tear the door off its hinges. They both knew that Sheriff Horn hadn't left that bullet as a prank. It was a promise. And in Red Willow County, promises written in lead were the only ones that were ever kept. The dawn arrived not with hope, but with a cold, damp clarity that exposed every scar on the land. The storm had passed, leaving the earth smelling of wet clay and bruised sage, a scent that felt ancient and sorrowful. Mist clung to the low ground, obscuring the holes where cattle broke their legs and the fence lines that marked the boundaries of failure. Silas stepped off the porch, his boots sinking into mud that sucked at his heels with a greedy sound. He walked the perimeter, his eyes scanning for damage, but he found something far more unsettling than a broken rail. Near the corral, a single fence board had been shifted, not kicked in by a horse, but pried loose and set gently on the ground. It was a message, silent and precise. It said, "We were here while you slept. We can come closer whenever we choose." Silas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. He slotted the board back into place, hammering the nails with a violence that betrayed his calm expression, trying to seal the breach before Eliza woke to see how vulnerable they truly were. They spent the morning working in a silence that was thick with unsaid things. Work was the only common language they had left. It was a way to impose order on a world that felt increasingly chaotic. Silas struggled with a rotted post, his frustration mounting as the wet wood refused to hold the new nails. He struck the metal askew, bending it. Suddenly, a hand reached out. Eliza didn't speak. She simply took the hammer from his grip. Her movements were stiff, guarded, but her hands knew what they were doing. She adjusted the angle of the nail, tapping it gently to set the bite before driving it home with a single, clean strike. It wasn't just a display of skill. It was a revelation of a past life where she had been capable, useful, and something other than a victim. She handed the hammer back, her eyes meeting his for a split second. In that look, Silas saw the first spark of defiance he had witnessed since the barn. She wasn't fixing the fence for him. She was fixing it because she refused to live in a ruin. Later, inside the cabin, the air was heavy with the smell of wood smoke and the bitter tang of cheap coffee. Eliza held her tin cup with both hands, letting the heat seep into her cold fingers. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Silas sat opposite her, watching the flames dance. "When I saw you on that platform," he said, his voice rough with the gravel of regret, "I looked for the child I remembered, the one who used to chase the dogs around the wagon wheel." Eliza took a slow sip, her gaze never leaving the fire. "That girl died in the fire, Silas," she said, her voice devoid of self-pity, stating it as a simple biological fact. "What you bought is just what survived." Silas nodded slowly. He stood up and retrieved a small, polished wooden box from beneath his cot. He placed it on the table between them. It looked out of place in the rough cabin, too delicate, too preserved. "I have no right to keep these," Silas said, sliding the box toward her. Eliza stared at the lid as if it were a coiled snake. Her hand trembled as she reached out, her fingertips brushing the wood before flipping the latch. Inside lay the detritus of a shattered family, a blue ribbon faded to gray, a small stone carved into the shape of a bird, and a brass button from a coat. Eliza's breath hitched, a sharp, ragged sound that tore through the room. She picked up the button, her thumb tracing the anchor stamped into the metal. "This was Thomas's," she whispered. "He was wearing this coat when they took us." She looked up at Silas, her eyes swimming with a mixture of grief and fury. "Why?" she demanded. "Why save the button and not the boy?" Silas flinched as if struck. "Because I was a coward," he answered, not looking away, "and cowards only pick up the pieces that are easy to carry." The moment was shattered by the sharp, rhythmic barking of the ranch dog, a warning sound, not a greeting. Silas was on his feet instantly, the revolver in his hand before the chair had finished scraping against the floor. Eliza stood too, backing into the shadows of the corner, the button still clutched in her fist like a talisman. Outside, the heavy thud of hooves churned the mud in the yard. Silas stepped onto the porch, the gun held low but visible. Sheriff Horn sat on a massive bay horse, flanked by two deputies who looked less like lawmen and more like hired muscle. The moonlight glinted off Horn's badge, turning the star into a cold silver eye. "Late hour for a social call," Silas said, his voice steady. Horn leaned forward, resting his forearms on the saddle horn. "Just checking on my constituents," he smiled, though his eyes remained dead. "Rumors are flying, Silas. Federal marshals are sniffing around the county line, asking about auctions, asking about people who don't exist on paper." "She's free, Horn," Silas stated, tightening his grip on the revolver. "I paid the coin." Horn laughed softly, a sound that grated on the nerves. "You paid a price, sure, but freedom? That requires paperwork. That requires the law to agree with you. And out here, I am the law." He gestured to one of the deputies, who tossed a burlap sack onto the porch. It landed with a wet, heavy thud. "We found something of yours down by the creek," Horn said. Silas nudged the sack open with his boot. A child's shoe tumbled out, old, leather cracked, encrusted with dried river mud. It was identical to the ones Eliza's brother had worn 8 years ago. From the shadows of the doorway, Eliza let out a choked sound. Horn's smile widened. "Consider this a courtesy warning. History has a way of repeating itself if you don't know when to walk away. Give her up, Silas. Don't make me dig 2 holes instead of 1. Silas kicked the shoe aside and raised the revolver, leveling it at Horn's chest. The deputies tensed, hands hovering over their own weapons. "Get off my land," Silas growled, the tremor in his hands gone. "If you come back, Horn, bring more men. You're going to need them." The sheriff stared at the gun barrel, his smile fading into a look of cold calculation. He nodded once, slowly. "Have it your way, old man. But remember, a house divided against itself cannot stand, and your house is built on kindling." He wheeled his horse around and galloped into the dark, his men following close behind. The thunder of their retreat faded, leaving a silence that felt temporary and fragile. Silas stood on the porch for a long time, listening to the wind. When he turned back, Eliza was standing in the doorway, her face pale but her eyes dry. "They aren't going to stop," she said. "No," Silas agreed, holstering his weapon. "They won't." He looked at her, really looked at her, seeing the steel core beneath the trauma. "We can't stay here, Eliza. This house is a coffin waiting for a lid." Eliza stepped onto the porch, looking out at the dark hills where the danger waited. "Running is just dying slower," she said, echoing a thought she had carried for years. "If we leave, we don't just run. We go to where it matters." Silas frowned. "What do you mean?" Eliza turned to him, the moonlight catching the hard line of her jaw. "Horn mentioned a federal marshal. If he's scared of him, that means the marshal is real. And if he's real, maybe he's the weapon we need." It was a desperate, insane plan. To ride across open country hunted by the law, to find a stranger who might not even help. But looking at the shoe on the porch, Silas knew they had no other choice. The next morning brought a stranger, but not an enemy. He walked his horse up the drive, hands raised high to show empty palms. He was young, disheveled, with the look of a man who had been looking over his shoulder for too long. "Name's Everett Pike," he called out as Silas aimed his rifle from the window. "I'm not here to fight. I'm here because I have a conscience that won't shut up." Silas let him approach, though he kept the rifle shouldered. Everett dismounted and pulled a folded sweat-stained paper from his vest. "I was there that night," he said, his voice shaking. 8 years ago. I rode with Horn's father. I didn't strike the match, but I watched it burn." Eliza stepped out onto the porch, her presence stopping Everett cold. He looked at her with the shame of a sinner facing judgment. "I can't undo it," he whispered, but I stole this from Horn's office safe. Silas took the paper. It was a ledger, a list of names, dates, and payments. Beside the entry for the Moore family was a note, land acquisition via removal, paid in full. It was proof of murder, written in black ink. Horn knows it's missing, Everett said, wiping sweat from his forehead. He's building a posse right now, not to arrest you, but to bury you. He can't let this paper get to Dry Creek. Silas looked at Eliza. The decision hung between them, heavy and absolute. Dry Creek is 2 days' hard ride, Silas said. Through the canyon. Eliza took the paper from his hand, folding it carefully. Then we ride hard, she said. We find this Marshall Boone, and we finish it. There was no more hesitation in her. The victim was gone. The survivor had taken the wheel. They packed only what they could carry, leaving the rest to the ghosts. As they mounted their horses, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of dust and vengeance. The hunt was on. The land beyond the ranch was not merely empty, it was aggressively desolate, a vast expanse of scrub brush and alkali flats that seemed designed to strip a human being of hope. The sun beat down with a relentless, hammering rhythm, turning the air above the trail into a shimmering mirage of heat and dust. Silas, Eliza, and Everett rode in a tight formation, the silence between them filled only by the rhythmic creak of saddle leather and the heavy, laboring breath of the horses. They were moving through a landscape that felt like purgatory, a place between the life they were fleeing and the uncertain justice they sought. For Eliza, the sensation of movement was disorienting. For years, her world had been defined by boundaries. The walls of a barn, the rail of a fence, the length of a chain. Now, the horizon stretched out infinitely, terrifying in its openness. She gripped the reins with white-knuckled intensity, her body learning the rhythm of the horse, her mind struggling to catch up with the reality that she was no longer waiting for permission to move. Everett Pike rode with the erratic energy of a man who expects a bullet between the shoulder blades at any moment. He kept glancing back, his eyes scanning the ridgelines with frantic paranoia. "We aren't making enough distance," he muttered, wiping sweat from a face that was already sunburned and peeling. "Horn's horses are grain-fed. Ours are grass-fed and tired. It's simple math, Silas. He's going to catch us before we hit the river." Silas didn't turn around. He rode with the slumped, enduring posture of a man who had made peace with bad odds decades ago. "Panic kills the horse before the run is done, Everett," Silas said, his voice low and steady. "We keep this pace. If we push them now, they'll be dead by sunset, and we'll be walking." It was a grim calculation, the kind of arithmetic survival required. Eliza watched Silas, noting the way his eyes never stopped moving, scanning the terrain not for escape, but for tactical advantage. He wasn't running. He was repositioning. By mid-afternoon, the geography began to shift. The flat scrublands gave way to jagged hills, the earth rising up in broken, rocky teeth. It was harder riding, but it offered cover. As they crested a small rise, Everett gasped and pointed behind them. Miles back, a plume of dust rose into the cobalt sky, too focused to be wind, too large to be a single rider. It was a column. Horn was coming, and he was moving fast. "He's cut the angle," Silas noted, his jaw tightening. "He knows the terrain better than I gave him credit for." He looked ahead, where the trail narrowed into a shadowy gash between two towering cliffs, a place the locals called the Needle's Eye. It was a choke point. If they could get through it, the twisting canyon would hide their tracks. If they were caught inside, it would be a shooting gallery. "Into the pass," Silas ordered, spurring his horse. "Don't stop for anything." They plunged into the shadow of the canyon. The temperature dropped instantly, the air turning cool and smelling of damp stone and stagnant water. The walls rose vertically on either side, blocking out the sun and turning the sky into a thin ribbon of blue far above. The sound of the horses' hooves echoed off the rock, magnifying into a thunderous clatter that seemed deafening. It was a claustrophobic nightmare, a stone throat threatening to swallow them whole. Eliza felt a primal fear rising in her chest, the fear of being trapped, of walls closing in. But she pushed it down, focusing on the back of Silas's coat. They were halfway through when the rhythm of the ride was broken. A sound echoed from ahead of them, not behind. The sharp, unmistakable click of a rifle hammer being cocked. Silas pulled his horse up so hard it reared, hooves pawing the air. The trap had been waiting. Blocking the narrow exit of the pass were 4 riders, sitting their horses with the casual arrogance of men who hold all the cards. In the center sat Sheriff Horn, looking entirely at ease, as if he were greeting neighbors on a Sunday morning. The dust from the pursuit behind them was already visible at the canyon entrance. Silas and his group were effectively corked in a bottle. "Afternoon," Horn called out, his voice amplified by the canyon acoustics. "You folks look like you're in a hurry." Silas steadied his horse, his hand resting near his rifle scabbard, though he knew the draw would be too slow. "Let us pass, Horn," Silas said, his voice echoing flatly. "This doesn't have to end in blood." Horn smiled, a thin, predatory expression. "It already has, Silas. You stole property, you stole state evidence, and you involved a federal man in local business. There's no version of this where you ride away." "I'm not property," Eliza spoke up. Her voice was not loud, but in the echoing canyon it carried with a crystalline clarity. She guided her horse forward until she was beside Silas. She looked Horn in the eye, her gaze steady, stripping away the authority he wore like a costume. "And that paper isn't evidence. It's a confession." Horn's smile vanished. He looked at her with a mixture of annoyance and genuine loathing. "You don't get a voice here, girl. You're just the reason these 2 men are going to die." He raised his hand, a signal to the men on the ridges above them, men Silas hadn't even seen until now. "Drop the weapons," Horn commanded, "or we turn this canyon into a grave." Everett was shaking, his face the color of ash. "Silas," he whimpered, "there's too many." The walls seemed to lean in. The dust from the rear guard was choking the air behind them. It was checkmate. Then the world exploded. It didn't start with Horn or Silas. A gunshot cracked from high up on the canyon rim, the sharp, high-velocity report of a long-range buffalo rifle. One of Horn's deputies at the canyon exit jerked violently, tumbling from his saddle before the sound even registered. Chaos erupted. Horses screamed and reared, terrified by the sudden violence in the confined space. Horn shouted orders that were lost in the cacophony. "Move!" Silas roared, seeing the opening in the confusion. He slapped the rump of Eliza's horse, sending her surging forward. Another shot rang out from the mysterious position above, precise, disciplined fire. A second man on the ridge scrambled for cover, his hat spinning away into the void. This wasn't a shootout. It was an ambush reversed. The confusion bought them seconds, and in a gunfight, seconds were lifetimes. They charged the exit. Everett, finding a reserve of courage in his terror, pulled his pistol and fired blindly at the blocking riders, forcing them to scatter. Silas rode flank, his Winchester pumping, covering Eliza as they punched through the line. Horn fired back, his bullet tearing through the sleeve of Silas's coat, biting a line of fire across his arm. But Silas didn't slow down. They burst out of the canyon mouth and into the blinding sunlight of the open plains, the transition from dark to light momentarily blinding them. Behind them, the bottleneck worked in their favor. Horn's men, pushing from the rear, collided with the men at the front, creating a snarling mass of horseflesh and shouting men. Silas glanced up at the high ridge as they galloped past. For a fleeting second, he saw a silhouette against the sun, a lone figure, rifle rested on a knee, watching them run. No wave, no signal, just a silent guardian who vanished back into the rocks as quickly as he had appeared. They rode until the horses were frothing and stumbling, putting miles of broken terrain between them and the ambush. Night fell like a heavy curtain, hiding them in the vastness of the plains. They made camp in a dry wash, hidden from the skyline. The adrenaline crash was brutal. Everett sat on a stone, trembling uncontrollably as the reality of the violence washed over him. Silas tended to his arm, binding the graze with a strip of cloth, his face grim. Eliza walked to the edge of the wash, looking back the way they had come. The silence of the desert was absolute, a stark contrast to the deafening noise of the canyon. She looked up at the stars, millions of them, indifferent and cold. "Who was it?" she asked softly, turning to Silas. "The man on the ridge. Who was he?" Silas tied off the bandage with his teeth and pulled his coat back on. "I don't know," he admitted, checking the action of his rifle. "Maybe a friend. Maybe just someone who hates Horn more than we do." He looked at Eliza, seeing the change in her. The trembling victim of the auction block was gone. In her place was someone forged in the fire of the last few hours. "We have a day's lead now," Silas said, "but Horn won't stop. He can't. If we get that ledger to Marshal Boone, his life is over. Eliza sat down across from him, the firelight casting deep shadows on her face. Then we don't just run to Boone, she said, her voice possessing a new steel-edged weight. We make sure that when we get there we have more than just a piece of paper. We need to be ready to fight the war, not just the battle. Everett looked up, his eyes wide. Fight! We barely survived running away. Eliza picked up a stick and poked the small fire, sending sparks drifting toward the heavens. Horn thinks we're prey, she said. Prey runs, prey hides. But we aren't prey anymore. We're witnesses. She looked at the two men, and in that moment, she was the leader of their ragged little army. Tomorrow, we don't ride to escape. We ride to end this. Silas watched her, a slow realization dawning on him. He had bought her to save her, but out here under the hard white stars, he realized she might be the one saving them. The desert wind whispered through the sagebrush, carrying the scent of rain from a distant storm. The final confrontation was coming, and for the first time, Silas allowed himself to believe they might actually win. The morning sun did not rise gently, it bleached the sky white, stripping the landscape of shadow and secret. They moved out before the heat could settle, riding through a country that was shifting from the desolate scrub of the Badlands to something greener, though no less dangerous. The river crossings were treacherous, the water running low and fast over slick stones. Silas led them downstream, letting the current wash away the physical evidence of their passing, though the psychological weight of the chase remained. Eliza rode with her back straight, her eyes scanning the horizon, not with the skittish fear of prey, but with the calculated observation of a scout. The transformation that had begun in the canyon was solidifying. The tremulous girl who had stared at the floorboards of the auction block was gone, replaced by a woman who understood that survival was an act of defiance. Everett rode between them, his initial panic settling into a grim, silent dread. He knew the stakes better than anyone. He knew that men like Horn didn't just kill their enemies, they erased them. By noon, the terrain softened into rolling hills dotted with oak and cedar. Fences appeared, neat, well-maintained lines that spoke of ownership and law, or at least the pretense of it. Smoke curled from distant chimneys, signaling the presence of Dry Creek. It was a town that had sprung up overnight on the promise of silver that never really materialized, leaving behind a community that felt temporary and slightly desperate. The main street was wide enough to turn a wagon team, flanked by buildings with false fronts that made them look taller and grander than they were. Men loitered on the boardwalks, watching the three strangers ride in with the casual, heavy-lidded suspicion of people who had learned that newcomers usually brought trouble. The town smelled of sawdust, unwashed horses, and the metallic tang of commerce. It was a place where everything was for sale, and morality was often the first thing discounted. Everett guided them toward a squat, brick building at the far end of the street. It lacked the grandiose signage of the saloons or the mercantile. A simple, faded flag hung limp above the door, and the windows were barred with iron. "That's it," Everett said, his voice tight. "Marshal Boone's office." They dismounted, tying their exhausted horses to the rail. Silas checked the load in his revolver, a habit born of years of mistrust, before stepping onto the boardwalk. Eliza smoothed her dress, dusting off the travel grit. She caught her reflection in the glass, gaunt, wild-haired, dirty, but she didn't look away. She held her head high and followed Silas inside. The office was cool and dim, a relief from the blinding sun. It smelled of stale coffee, old paper, and gun oil. Behind a desk scarred by knife whittling and cigarette burns sat a man who looked like he had been carved out of the same oak as the furniture. Marshal Harlan Boone was not a large man, but he occupied the room with a density that made him feel massive. His hair was shocked white, and his face was a map of deep lines etched by years of squinting into the sun and seeing the worst of human nature. He didn't stand when they entered. He simply looked up over the rim of his spectacles, his eyes grey and unreadable. "Help you?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that sounded like gravel shifting in a dry riverbed. Silas stepped forward, wasting no time on pleasantries. He pulled the folded ledger from his coat pocket and placed it on the desk, sliding it across the wood until it rested under Boone's hand. "We aren't here to buy, Marshal. We're here to trade. That paper for a life." Boone looked at the paper, then at Silas, and finally let his gaze drift to Eliza. He studied her for a long moment, not with lechery, but with recognition. He knew the look of a fugitive. Boone unfolded the document slowly, the crinkling of the paper the only sound in the room. He adjusted his glasses and began to read. As his eyes tracked down the list of names and the amounts paid, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The air grew heavy, charged with the static of impending violence. Boone's expression didn't change, but his posture did. He sat up straighter, the lethargy of the afternoon vanishing. He read the note about the land acquisition and the removal of the Moore family. He read the names of the men involved, men who sat on town councils, men who prayed loudly in church on Sundays. When he finished, he folded the paper carefully and placed his hand over it. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice quiet but carrying a dangerous edge. "Stolen," Everett blurted out, stepping forward. "From Horn's private safe. I took it." Boone looked at Everett, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. "You're Pike," he stated, not asking. "You rode with the old sheriff's crew." Everett nodded, shame coloring his cheeks. "I did, and I'm telling you, that list is real. Every name, every dollar." Boone leaned back in his chair, rubbing his jaw. "You realize what you've brought me?" he asked Silas. "This isn't just a crime report. This is a declaration of war. If I move on this, half the powerful men in Red Willow County go down. They won't go quietly." Silas leaned over the desk, his hands planted on the wood. "They burned a family alive for dirt, Marshal. They sold this girl like livestock. If that isn't worth a war, then take off the badge." The room went silent. Boone looked at Eliza again. She stepped forward, her voice steady. "My brother was 6 years old," she said. "His name was Thomas. He's on that list as an expense, a line item. Are you going to tell me that's the law?" Boone stared at her, and for a moment, the weary bureaucrat vanished, replaced by the man who had taken the oath. He sighed, a long, ragged exhalation that seemed to expel years of compromise. He stood up, reaching for the gun belt hanging on the wall. "I can't arrest a man based on a stolen paper alone," he said, buckling the leather around his waist. "But I can sure as hell ask him some questions that he won't want to answer." He grabbed a Winchester from the rack and a Stetson hat that had seen better decades. "And if he tries to stop me," Boone added, checking the lever action, "then he's obstructing a federal investigation, and that gives me all the permission I need." He looked at the three of them. "We ride now. If Horn knows you're here, he's already fortifying. We need to hit Red Willow before he digs in." The ride back to Red Willow was a blur of motion and tension. Boone rode point, his badge pinned to his vest, catching the last rays of the sun. He rode with the authority of the federal government, a force that even the wildest territories had to respect, at least in theory. Silas rode beside him, scanning the tree lines for ambush. Eliza and Everett brought up the rear. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of bruised purple and blood orange, they crested the final hill overlooking Red Willow. The town was quiet, too quiet. The streets were empty, the shutters drawn. It was the silence of a town that knew violence was coming and had decided to hide in the cellar until it was over. But at the end of the street, in front of the sheriff's office, a line of men stood waiting. Sheriff Horn was there, leaning against a hitching post, looking relaxed. Behind him stood 6 deputies, their shotguns held loosely but ready. They weren't hiding, they were waiting. Horn had expected them to run, but he had prepared for them to fight. As Boone led the group down the main street, the sound of their horses' hooves echoed off the wooden buildings like drum beats. Boone raised a hand, halting the group 20 yards from the sheriff. The distance was close enough to talk, but far enough to miss with a pistol if your hand shook. Horn pushed off the post and stepped into the street, smiling that same thin, cold smile. "Harlan," he called out, nodding to the marshal, "you're a long way from your jurisdiction and you're riding with known fugitives." Boone didn't smile. He dismounted slowly, his boots hitting the dust with a heavy thud. He held the ledger in his left hand, the rifle in his right. "I'm riding with witnesses, Caleb," Boone corrected, his voice projecting clearly to the men behind Horn. "And I'm holding a document that says you've been running a slaughterhouse, not a county." Horn's eyes flicked to the paper, his smile faltering for a fraction of a second. "Paper burns, Harlan. And witnesses. Well, they have a habit of disappearing in this country. He rested his hand on his revolver. You turn around now, and maybe you make it back to Dry Creek. You push this, and you don't. Silas dismounted and stood beside Boone, his own rifle leveled. Eliza slid from her saddle, standing exposed in the street, refusing to hide behind the men. We aren't going anywhere, she said. The air in the street grew thin, the tension stretched to the breaking point. A dog barked in the distance, a shutter slammed, and then Horn's hand twitched. The violence did not begin with a shout or a grand declaration. It began with the microscopic betrayal of a muscle. Horn's thumb slipped off the hammer of his revolver as he tried to draw, a fatal millisecond of hesitation born of arrogance. He had expected fear to freeze them. He hadn't calculated for the desperate clarity of people who had nothing left to lose. Silas moved. He didn't think about the mechanics of the action. His body simply remembered the war he had tried to forget. The stock of his Winchester hit his shoulder in a fluid motion, the barrel rising like a pointer finger of judgment. The shot cracked the air, a flat, ugly sound that slapped against the storefronts and echoed down the empty street. It wasn't a kill shot. Silas wasn't an executioner. The bullet tore through Horn's right shoulder, shattering the clavicle and spinning him around with the force of a mule kick. Horn's gun clattered into the dust, useless. He collapsed to his knees, clutching the ruin of his shoulder, his face draining of color as the shock set in. The silence that followed was louder than the gunshot. The 6 deputies behind him froze, their hands hovering over their weapons, paralyzed by the sudden inversion of power. Marshal Boone stepped forward, his voice booming with the authority of a man who commanded the whirlwind. "Federal officer!" he roared, leveling his rifle at the group. "The next man who touches iron spends the rest of his life in a territorial prison or ends it right here in the dirt. Choose now." The deputies looked at Horn, bleeding and gasping in the street, and then at Boone, who stood like a stone pillar. The spell of invincibility that Horn had cast over the town for a decade shattered. One by one, hands moved away from holsters. Boone didn't lower his weapon. He gestured to the youngest deputy, a boy no older than 20 who looked like he was about to be sick. "You," Boone barked, "pick up that paper." He pointed to the ledger where it had fallen in the dust during the scramble. The deputy hesitated, then stepped forward, retrieving the document with shaking hands. "Read the 3rd name on the list," Boone commanded, out loud, so the whole town hears who they've been working for. The deputy swallowed hard, his eyes scanning the page. "Joshua Miller," he read, his voice trembling. "Land seized, house burned, family removed." A murmur went through the other deputies. Joshua Miller had been the town grocer. Everyone had been told he moved east. "Read the next one," Boone ordered, his eyes never leaving the group. The truth spilled out into the street, name after name, atrocity after atrocity, stripping the veneer of law from what was effectively a criminal empire. Eliza walked forward. She moved past Silas, past Boone, until she was standing over Sheriff Horn. The man who had terrorized the county, who had sold human beings as if they were cattle, looked up at her. He wasn't a monster anymore. He was just a small, broken man bleeding into the dirt, smelling of sweat and fear. He expected her to spit, or perhaps to pick up his fallen gun. Instead, Eliza simply looked at him with a profound, terrifying emptiness. She saw the pathetic reality of him, a bully who had built a castle out of other people's suffering. "You don't own the world," she said softly, her voice carrying no anger, only a final, dismissing truth. "You just rented it with blood, and the lease is up." She turned her back on him, denying him the satisfaction of her rage. It was the ultimate victory. She rendered him irrelevant before the handcuffs even clicked. The aftermath was a blur of bureaucracy and cleanup, the unglamorous work of dismantling a tyranny. Boone arrested Horn and 3 of the deputies who had been deepest in the scheme. The others surrendered, eager to distance themselves from the crumbling regime. Everett Pike sat on the boardwalk, head in his hands, weeping quietly, not from sadness, but from the crushing relief of a conscience finally unburdened. Silas stood watch until the wagon carrying the prisoners rolled out of town, headed for a federal court in the capital. As the dust settled, the sun finally dipped below the horizon, bathing Red Willow in a twilight that felt cleaner, as if the very light had been scrubbed of a stain. Boone shook Silas's hand before he left. "You did a hard thing today, Reed," the marshal said. Silas looked at his own hands, weathered and scarred. "I just cleaned up a mess I let sit too long," he replied. They returned to the ranch 3 days later. The place looked different, though nothing had physically changed. The fence still leaned, the barn still needed paint, but the air felt lighter. The oppressive weight of the ghosts Silas had lived with for 8 years had lifted. Eliza stayed. There was no discussion about it. She simply fell into a rhythm of work and recovery. She planted a garden near the creek, coaxing life out of the stubborn soil. She spent hours in the orchard, sitting by the unmarked graves of her family, talking to the wind. Silas gave her space, understanding that healing is a solitary architecture. He worked the cattle, repaired the roof, and for the first time in a decade, he slept through the night without waking up reaching for a gun. They lived as two survivors, sharing the same lifeboat, bound by a trauma that was slowly turning into a scar, something that marked them but no longer hurt to the touch. Months passed. The seasons turned, the fierce heat of summer giving way to the golden haze of autumn. The aspen trees in the high country turned yellow, shivering like coins in the breeze. One crisp morning, Silas walked out to the porch to find Eliza saddling the bay mare. She had a bedroll tied behind the cantle and a saddlebag packed with supplies. She was wearing a new coat, one she had sewn herself, and her hair was tied back, revealing a face that had filled out, the hollows of starvation gone. Silas leaned against the porch post, sipping his coffee. He didn't ask where she was going. He didn't ask her to stay. He knew that cages, even open ones, were still cages to someone who had been chained. "The coffee's fresh," was all he said. Eliza tightened the cinch and turned to him. The sun was rising behind her, framing her in light. She looked at the ranch, at the repaired fence, at the grave markers in the distance. Then she looked at Silas. "I'm not running this time," she said. It was an important distinction. "I'm going because there's a life out there I haven't seen yet. A life that belongs to me." Silas nodded slowly. "You've got a good horse under you," he said, "and you know the way to the main road." It was the closest he could come to saying he would miss her. Eliza walked up the steps and stood in front of him. For a moment he thought she might hug him, but that wasn't their way. Instead, she reached out and took his hand, squeezing it once hard, a warrior acknowledging another warrior. "You didn't save me, Silas," she said, her green eyes clear and steady. "I want you to know that. I saved myself, but you stood next to me while I did it." Silas swallowed past the lump in his throat. "That's more than I did before," he whispered. Eliza smiled then, a real smile, one that reached her eyes and banished the last of the shadows. "It was enough," she said. She mounted the horse with a fluid grace, gathering the reins. She didn't look back as she trotted out of the yard. Silas watched her go, a solitary figure moving against the vast open canvas of the west. She rode not with the frantic haste of an escapee, but with the deliberate pace of a traveler who owns the road beneath her hooves. Silas stood on the porch until she was just a speck on the horizon, until the dust of her departure had settled back into the earth. The silence of the ranch returned, but it was no longer the silence of a tomb. It was the quiet of a library or a cathedral, a peaceful, contemplative stillness. He looked out at the land, at the hard white sun rising to claim the day. The world was still brutal, it was still unforgiving, but it was also wide, and it was free. Silas Reed finished his coffee, set the cup on the rail, and stepped down into the yard to begin the day's work. The past was finally a country he had emigrated from. He walked toward the barn, the sound of his boots on the earth steady and sure, a man finally living in the present tense.